Good morning, everyone. We can kick this off. I'm Catherine from PSFK, and I'll hand it off to Jeff to get started.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully everyone's doing well, staying healthy. During this presentation, I'm going to try to provide some information that's useful to you as brand thinkers and brand leaders in terms of taking purposeful actions, both in terms of strategy and framework, as well as through some examples. And we've built in Q&A at several points during this, so feel free to fire off as we get going. Hannah at H. Zimmerman at Barkley US is an alternative way, if the chat is not working, to send questions, and she'll stop me and ask them. All right, we're talking a lot right now about sort of flattening the curve, and one of the things our team did start working on around March 13th is how brands should start thinking about flattening their curve. And the reality is there's a lot of chaos and a lot of folks who are frightened, and folks who are in leadership roles are supposed to lead people, and they're also frightened, right? So different folks are in different points in this curve. And so phase one is adjust. Many brands and folks are still in the adjust phase in terms of what this looks like and the new normal. And then there's going to be a peak, and the peak's going to be different for different folks and for different brands. And then there's a third phase. By the way, Catherine, if you can minimize that screen on the right, it would help me. I don't think I can, so that I can see my full screen. At any rate, if you're interested in the thinking behind this, feel free to use that link at the bottom. There's an entire article and briefing on this three-phase view. And the key things to think about, and we'll talk about this, is thinking with empathy, thinking about things that are uniquely true to your brand, thinking about taking action versus just communicating, and avoiding harms, right? If I was creating a Venn diagram for brands, it's sort of like 4 circles. We have to avoid harms to people, to consumers, et cetera, to stakeholders. All right, half step back. What is a purpose advantage? I finished a book recently that I authored called The Purpose Advantage. And how did I get to the topic of the purpose advantage? The short version of the story is, I don't know how many of you failed at Google searches, but I failed a lot. In 2010, I failed again and again and again to find information on millennials as consumers. And that series of failures was wildly frustrating, because every time I searched, I got really terrible information back. One of two things: the topic's not relevant, or nobody had really done anything on a fact basis of any substance on millennials as consumers. And I searched every combination of things I could think of, from Gen Y and millennials and consumers and marketing and any number of terms. One thing led to another. In 2010 and 11, I conducted in a joint partnership between Barkley, where I work, and the Boston Consulting Group, the first large-scale study of millennials as consumers, published that research, and then wrote a first book called Marketing to Millennials. And since then, we've been doing research on a longitudinal basis, studying consumer trends, trying to publish content with high frequency in terms of short-form content, and then on top of that, trying to speak about it and consult on it. And if I had to leave you with one quick thought about it, and that is, the myth that consumers are disloyal is that it's a myth. Consumers are discerning. They trade up and they trade down. They make decisions to spend a little more for brands that are important, and they trade to private label when the brand or category is of low value. And we see this in their behavior all the time. Modern consumers are day traders, and strong brands win, and weak brands often get substituted out. And so there are a lot of myths around consumers that we've debunked, and myths can be very disruptive, because even if there's some truth to the myth, it usually is not helpful to the leader or the brand strategy professional to embrace the myth. So with that quick overview, if we were to dive into the book and the strategy format, we talked about functional, emotional, and societal benefits being a purpose advantage. We all know brands have to have functional benefits. Emotional benefits are truly important, particularly if you don't compete on lowest possible price, because without emotional benefits, you tend to have no price elasticity power, and then societal benefits. And if you're a larger brand, the framework we used is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of those, and we codified that in the book. There's a fourth ingredient that you need besides these three criteria to have a purpose advantage, and that is, metaphorically speaking, you use purpose as a verb. And now more than ever in this crisis, you have to use brand actions. Whole brands, the brands that were using whole brand thinking, always have used marketing and purpose as a verb. And when I say always, I mean for the past 4 or 5 years, you would see brands like Patagonia, for example, take action. So it's not talking about something necessarily that's going to matter. It's doing things that matters. It's the actions, and consumers can sniff through and see whether you're doing that or whether you're purpose washing. All right. So if I took you into the grocery store right now and I put you in the laundry detergent aisle, historically speaking, this would be the lowest interest aisle on the planet. Now, right now it's not, because we're all focused on cleanliness. But I could tell you with great certainty that 90+% of folks, if I said there's an orange bottle in the detergent aisle, would be able to tell me it's Tide, even if I didn't show them this visual. I know this because I've done this again and again with large groups, and I'll say, I'm in the detergent aisle and I can't remember, there's an orange bottle in front of me, and people will shout, it's Tide, it's Tide. Now, right now, this category has become highly, highly interesting to people because of the crisis. But before, it was very low interest, very, very low interest. And yet this brand that everyone knows historically up until the crisis was struggling. It was losing share, and they're a low price brand, and they're a strong recognized brand. So there was no connection between brand awareness and brand performance. The brand they were losing share to is a brand called Seventh Generation. Seventh Generation charges more. It's a lesser known brand. It's a smaller brand. And prior to the crisis, it was on fire in a category of very low interest. I had a chance to interview the CEO twice during the crisis already. And what he said is, of course, everyone in the category is now unable to meet demand because folks are very focused on hygiene and cleanliness. Now, having said that, after the crisis, it would be his thesis that there'll be a new normal, and the new normal will be much higher interest in this topic. So the category will become more important and usage will be higher. This brand was taking share and charging $1 a bottle more than Tide, the brand that everyone knew. So why is that possible? It's because Seventh Generation actually has a purpose advantage. And in the interviews I did with their team, what I found is they had functional benefits, emotional benefits, societal benefits, focused on climate change, which is one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they're consistently using purpose as a verb, taking brand actions. Whereas the well-known brand historically used advertising and marketing. So they weren't using whole brand thinking, they were using traditional forms of, we're large, we're very effective, we're very low priced, we're very affordable, and we'll tell everybody about us. And that model doesn't hold the way it historically did. If you were to go further, what you would find is the best brands have a flywheel. In the case of Seventh Generation, the price of admission is creating safe, natural, and effective products. And if they do that, they have to take some of the profits they make and reinvest in innovation. In fact, one of the products I saw that they had in development late last year that I know they were launching was an Amazon product pre-crisis that would do 60+ loads of laundry in about a 14, 16 ounce kind of bottle. Think about less, less, and less, which is what their customer wants. Less carbon to move liquid, which is heavy, from one point to another. Less cost to the consumer of moving that heavy liquid from one point to another. Less impact on the planet because they have a dosing cap that allows you to use a very small amount of a hyper-concentrated solution to clean your clothing. So that would be consistent with this brand. Other brands would have a different innovation flywheel based on their sustainable development goals. If I was looking at Mod Pizza, which is obviously impacted by a crisis like this, they had an entire purpose on second chances. They hire people who've been incarcerated. Their flywheel would look at the human capital involved in their giving people second chances. They screen those people. They have an advantage in terms of less turnover. They have an advantage in terms of higher guest satisfaction, less training costs associated with less turnover. So the flywheel works. In every case, what we find when brands do this really well is the flywheel is in harmony. Because when the flywheel is in harmony, you can make a profit and add good to society. And they're not mutually exclusive. Adding good to society for most companies, not all, means I have to have profits. Without profits, I can't reinvest in innovation in the case of seventh generation. I can't reinvest in human capital in the case of Mod Pizza to train people. So profit has to be reinvested to make the flywheel work. I'm going to pause, Hannah, and see if I have any questions at this point, now that I've provided a quick overview, and before I get into the meat of the presentation for today.
No questions yet.
Okay, no questions yet. So if I were to put you in this grocery store that we've been discussing, we've all faced this dilemma, right? It's a sea of choice. And the reality is consumers, as we discussed earlier, are discerning, and they trade up and they trade down. And the truth of the matter is emotional decisions usually trump functional, rational side decisions, right? You don't see consumers walking down the grocery store with a spreadsheet that lists the price per ounce of a box of cereal, flavor score for a box of cereal, sustainability score for a box of cereal, and if the shoe fits, or in my case, perhaps a fiber score, right? It's not what we do. We pick one and we move on. In this case, the entire category has failed to meet the palate states and need states of a changing consumer. So the whole category is weakened as consumers move to Greek yogurt. So all of us have to be conscious not only of the direct competitors we face, but the indirect alternatives that often can come along and meet those changing need states and palate states. What we found in our research, and we did this in a large-scale study that I'm not going to go through in depth, I'm happy to share it offline with anyone who would like to discuss, is there is a connection between love and money. Now, many of you grew up in a time where your parents may have said, hey, son or daughter, no connection between love and money. I'm here to tell you, not going to get in an argument with you about your parents, but when it comes to brands, there's absolutely a connection. The most loved brands have a frequency of use and price elasticity advantage, and there absolutely will be a connection between love and brand performance. The more love they generate, the more they perform. So we started studying this. We did it initially with CPG brands, then moved into retail, and from there into restaurants and other categories. And we found the data was remarkably consistent. Now, there is differences between category to category in terms of how important brand is. Not gonna lie to you there. And the study we did was based on derived importance. So to clarify, and I know many of you would know this, stated importance is what we say. And so we first measured stated importance with consumers age 16 to 65. We were looking across generations. And then we measured derived importance. Derived importance is how I spend my time and money. So I could say I'm going to be healthy, but the truth of the matter is, if I didn't exercise today or I eat something unhealthy, then my derived and my stated diverge. And the other thing we found, and you may all be aware of it, is consumers will say one thing and do another, and it can vary by day of week. On Monday, I might stick to my exercise and diet routine, and on Saturday, I might be like, I just want a little bit of pizza, and I'm going to break down. So what we found was young people were sort of the canary in the coal mine with respect to trends. And so we called it a youth mindset because when we were looking at the CPG and retail and restaurant categories and doing this work for clients, again and again and again, the trends that were sort of laddering and happening faster and accelerating were initially often adopted by younger people. So I wasn't the first person to use Venmo, but if I want to try to pay the kid who helps me around the house with lawn stuff, Venmo's the way to go. So I quickly adapt. I'm older, I'm a fast follower. And we found again and again, these most loved brands tended to embrace 6 mindsets. Now, I want to be perfectly clear. If you compete on low price, the mindsets will be less important. If you compete on differentiation, the mindsets will be more important. And if you have an advantage on something, that advantage can trump a mindset. So if you have better design, lower cost, better distribution, then mindsets may not hold out. But time and again, for the vast majority of brands we studied, in category after category, we found correlation and causation related to brand love, meaning most loved brands outperform, and these mindsets. All right. What I would hate to have you think is purpose is the only thing, because the reality is if you focus only on purpose, chances are you're going to fail. I will also say if you don't have a purpose, then you are fighting an uphill battle, because a discerning consumer absolutely considers all factors. And the reality is oftentimes we see convergence, quality, price, flavor, availability, they converge. And when they converge, then the values the brand has and the actions the brand takes can be what differentiates brand A from brand B. So purpose was not the key driver, but purpose in combination with another driver like innovation or what have you would often be crucial and give brands a significant edge. So when I talk about purpose or purpose and sustainability, and I use that interchangeably because sustainability is often a key part of having a purpose advantage for the vast majority of brands. What I would say is, how are you adding good to society? So, for example, Tony's Chocolonely. I'm a chocolate lover, prefer dark if you're sending me any. But the reality is Tony's Chocolonely is not as well known as Hershey's or Mars or any number of large brands. And if they don't have flavorful products, no one's going to buy it. If the price point isn't within reason, no one's going to buy it. But if I told you 70% of cacao beans come from West Africa and less than 2% of the chocolate economy goes to West African growers, and many of them are literally employing slave labor, Tony's on a mission to end slavery in West Africa. So if I love the flavor, if the price point's fair, and I understand the brand's purpose is to change that disequilibrium, then guess what? I probably would try Tony's Chocolonely, assuming it's available to me, and I can access it. So that would be a simple example of a brand that is trying to lean into its purpose. Others might be brands like American Express, which created something called Small Business Saturday. And I know American Express is participating in the World Retail event. And I had a chance to interview the EVP of American Express in New York when we kicked off the book launch. The reality is, their brand has an opportunity, if not a responsibility, to aid small business owners. And so something like Small Business Saturday is a brilliant idea that is part of the DNA of that brand. And when I look at brands like Walmart, when Hurricane Katrina hit, there was no brand better prepared, and I mean no brand, including the federal government brand, that had the distribution, logistics, and transportation that Walmart already had in place to activate instantly to help people devastated by that hurricane, right? And so there was a brand that was able to take action faster than FEMA, faster than anyone else, because their brand DNA was built on things that were super important in a crisis like that. So, and by the way, as an aside, some people don't have any idea that Walmart has a tremendous sustainability track record and has for years. So there's a lot to unpack here. The important thing to understand is purpose alone is probably not going to be a winning strategy, but purpose and sustainability in combination with one of the other mindsets will often be what tips for consumers in terms of top performing brands. So I want to go back to the framework, the 3 phases, and look at how it's being applied to this crisis and see if we can learn some things about that. All right. So the 3 phases, what your brand should be doing, how could you act like a whole brand, and adjust and move through this adjustment phase. And then when we get to the peak, how does your brand's role change? And I'd like to do this use this framework through some examples. So show you some examples of brands doing it. If I were to draw it differently and perhaps use a Venn diagram, one thing I might try to do is think about things like what's uniquely true about your brand. That might be one part of the diagram. How can we use empathy? That might be another part of the diagram. How do we take meaningful actions? Another part. And then finally, how do we avoid harms to our employees, to our customers, et cetera? So I would build out a diagram with information about your brand. And then I would try to think about how these all fit together, including that uniquely true to the brand piece, so that we're creating super added value during a crisis, because empathy is something that folks are going to need. So first example I'm going to share, around March 13th, one of our clients, Planet Fitness, our strategy folks were in discussion with, what are we going to do, right? Like, gyms are still open at this point, but a lot of gyms are going to start closing pretty fast. And so we move from sort of workout to work in, because, to feel healthy during a crisis, many of us need to be able to exercise. We need to be able to, continue to do the things we've always done, but we aren't going to be able to do it necessarily in the same place. So we started to host work-ins, and we did it on a regular basis in the evening, streaming content in order to help people who were used to coming to the gym, including people who came to Planet Fitness, be able to do what they've always done. A second example, and I apologize, my screen is blocked in part, and I don't have a way to unblock it, is for Fruit of the Loom. And Fruit of the Loom has long worked with us on sustainability strategy, and they quickly pivoted more than a few weeks ago to creating PPEs, because there's a tremendous shortage of PPEs. And that decision, obviously crucial for a brand that's in the manufacturing space to make quickly. Another brand that I think that I'd highlight is McDonald's, which is known for their breakfasts and known for being very accessible in terms of accessibility, and so they're trying to say thank you to people who are on the front lines of this, because people on the front lines of this are putting their personal health at risk every time they go in to work, whether they're a nurse, whether they're a doctor, whether they're a healthcare worker. They're fighting this day in and day out. I don't think this is an unknown story, but LVMH in Paris quickly also pivoted as a manufacturer and started making hand sanitizer. Again, think about that, Venn diagram. What's empathy? How can they bring empathy and something uniquely useful to the brand, and making that pivot quickly and providing something that people desperately need during the crisis. And then finally, H&M. And H&M, is a fashion industry brand. And again, we have a shortage of PPEs, and they made a pivot. And I think in their pivot, they've tried to do it in a uniquely H&M way. From what I've seen, creating some things that are more personalized than just the basic PPEs you could find, which I think is consistent with their brand personality, and something that many consumers who probably have never used PPEs, particularly in the US, I realize in Asia, having traveled there extensively in the past, that it's not so uncommon, but they are likely using that and using it in a more personalized way than something they might be able to find otherwise. So I'd like to pause, because I did cover quite a bit of content fairly quickly, and see if there are any questions that either Catherine or Hannah has seen in the process, and be happy to take those questions.
So Leandro Sell says, it seems everyone's purpose is the same now. How can you differentiate in this environment?
Yeah, I think differentiating becomes harder, right? I think because you're in a crisis, and I think that's a I didn't catch the first name of the person who asked it, but that's a fair question. What you're trying to do is something uniquely true to your brand. So for example, Seventh Generation has always been taking brand actions. I know from interviewing them for the book that they gave their employees off on Earth Day, for example, if they wanted to in some way support Earth Day. And they've done a number of things in terms of brand actions. Doing that today would be less unique because lots of brands are letting employees do things that are more consistent, right? So I think the thing to understand is that differentiation becomes a little bit harder. Planet Fitness having streaming workouts is not perhaps as unique, because other brands quickly then make a pivot as well, and within a week they're also doing things like, hey, you can have yoga from our, yoga studio. So the differentiation doesn't necessarily last a long time, but you're trying to be empathetic and have a service mindset, and be consistent in that approach. Hopefully, more and more brands are thinking about this longitudinally, and it's part of what they've been thinking about for a long time in terms of how they serve their employees, their consumers or customers, depending on whether they're B2B or B2C. The unique part comes, in my view, in part through thinking about that on a longitudinal basis and making sure you're laddering your brand authority to those sustainable development goals.
Great. Another question from Donald Don, who says, are there any brands that are doing it wrong? There's a fine line between right and wrong, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I highlighted a couple brands that were doing it wrong before the crisis in my book, and I'm happy to give a couple examples. The way you get accused of purpose washing is likely by talking about things that you have a short history of doing, and about trying to take credit for stuff prematurely. So, for example, Starbucks is a very powerful, strong brand. They started a campaign called #RaceTogether. Probably not their best decision. But then they adjusted and realized they'd made a mistake, and et cetera, decided, okay, not the right decision for our brand. I think, pre-crisis, Gillette got beat up by some, and others thought it was appropriate to talk about toxic masculinity. It's not that the topic of toxic masculinity is not a great topic. It was absolutely a fair topic. But, if you charge a pink tax to millions and millions of women for razors that are essentially the same, but they're pink instead of blue, then, how are you really entitled to have a conversation on toxic masculinity? In fact, Gillette, for years and years and years, embraced toxic masculinity to sell those same razors. So, to me, some consumers felt like there were still weeds in their garden, and yet they're trying to get credit for something where they've got, no longitudinal history, doing that, because it's now important to have a purpose and sustainability kind of a strategy. So I think the key thing to look at is, what's your brand's editorial authority, and how do you use purpose metaphorically as a verb? Because if you're not doing it and you're focused strictly on using it for a marketing and promotional scheme, that's going to fail. And that would be a losing strategy. You'd be better off not going down the road. And that's why I like to share that flywheel I shared earlier in the presentation. I talked about Mod Pizza. I showed the flywheel from the book for 7th Generation. If it's part of your business model, then it's integrated into how you operate, and you're thinking about it as a whole brand. If it's part of a marketing campaign, then you're at risk that you could be, a purpose washer.
So Haley James says, do you believe that all existing brands can have a true and meaningful purpose? Do you think that some brands will be left redundant post-COVID-19?
All is tough. I think nearly all brands can have a purpose. I mean, it's tough when you, if you're a brand that, I would say vast majority of brands can have a purpose, and perfect is the enemy of progress. So, I mean, we've run sustainability purpose workshops that are outlined in the book with brands that manufacture everything from ice cream to proteins that are, mass produced. And, you can be perfect, you can improve in terms of your purpose and sustainability significantly and be a long way from perfect. But all is tricky, because I don't know that I think all can. I think there's some brands that can't. And I certainly think there will be a new normal on the other side of that curve that we discussed, where people will look at values and make decisions, maybe even more so based on values. And I think there's certain categories that were before low interest that might be more interesting. I mean, when I made this presentation for several months and talked about 7th Generation, I mean, detergent and cleaning products would be the very bottom of the list of categories people would be interested in. I don't think that'll be true post-crisis. I don't think people will be hoarding as much, but the new normal is probably going to be, significantly more focused on, cleanliness and hygiene than it was pre-crisis. So that's a challenging path. I definitely think that there are a lot of consumers, when it's affordable, when it's available, prefer brands that are purposeful and sustainable. But can all brands get there? Probably not. Can most brands improve? Probably yes. Even brands that are large, that mass produce, can improve. They can have a lower carbon footprint, or they can tackle a big topic. I mean, Mod Pizza is not inherently different than another pizza chain. They don't have any secret mozzarella or secret pepperoni. Their entire purpose and sustainability strategy is giving second chances to people who were unemployed, incarcerated, and otherwise may not have had an opportunity in the workforce, and paying them a living wage, giving them training so they can either find something else, and they use Mod as a stepping stone to something else in their career, or stay at Mod and get promoted and find a career at Mod. And both scenarios are great. So their flywheel's in harmony, and their advantage is around a more empowered, engaged workforce. So, there's nothing inherently wonderful about pizza. I mean, I like it personally, but so I don't think it's like one category can or can't. And I think vast majority of brands can, but when I hear all, my answer is there are probably some that just, it's a big hill and they probably can't. Not a lot, but a few.
Yeah, totally. So Monica says, how do you help traditional brand marketers move from being more traditional to the whole marketing? This might be a broader one.
Yeah, no. So whole brand thinking, which is definitely available in that article that I had a hot link to at barkleys.com. It is a mindset for sure. I think it starts at the core with, for me, a lot of times the financial side, and having that conversation where it's like you understand longitudinally that when we look at most of the high performing brands financially, they apply whole brand thinking, which means they think about product design, brand culture, brand action. They think about things that are sort of more modern, consumer focused. And most of the largest brands grew up in an industrial area where they heated, beated, and treated their products. They used mass advertising to communicate, and they won. I mean, Tide is a classic example of a really strong brand that heated, beated, and treated its products, very low price, and got mass distribution. Along comes a different brand, Seventh Generation, with a different model, with a focus on, impact and applying the law of the Iroquois. How is it applying, to going to impact the next 7 generations? Seventh Generation doesn't create pods. Why? Not because they didn't have it in development. Of course they did. They had the same thing in development Tide did, but because they know that it could be mistaken for candy. And so they're not going to put profits ahead of the fact that they'll have to settle some claims. Any company can do that, right? I can say I'm going to allot $10 million for claims, and I'm going to make an extra $100 million. Seventh Generation, if you interview their CEO, he's like, yeah, we had that product in development. We could have launched it too. We didn't. It's inconsistent with our brand. Now, what you understand and you see again and again is these brands are getting rewarded. When I interviewed Unilever CEO, they have 400 brands in their portfolio, and it's a public company. And 69% of their growth, 69%, came from a tiny fraction of their sustainable living brands. And it's on their website, and you can see it. And these are the brands that are using whole brand thinking, right? So what you're seeing is many of the, I don't want to say small brands, because Patagonia and Seventh Generation and Ben & Jerry's and Mod Pizza, these are billion-dollar brands, okay? But many of the disruptive brands apply this whole brand framework. And so for me, it starts as a financial conversation personally, because I want them to understand that actually when you do these things, if you do them well and you connect your business model to it, your financial performance will actually be higher. Your sales growth and your margins will be higher. It's not inconsistent to make a profit and have a sustainability strategy. In fact, by having that strategy and sustainability, you should be able over time, if you've done the work right, to make more profit. Hopefully that helps. It's a discussion, and the data has to be part of that discussion. And it's a business model conversation, in my view, before it becomes a marketing conversation. The marketing conversation flows out of the business model conversation.
Great, yeah, that's a great answer.
Yeah, and if that person wants more contact, my partner Tim Gallis wrote an entire book on the topic.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
We have a nice one from Adrian Curiel, who says, what advice do you have for a challenger brand waiting to launch post-crisis? Was about to launch, but pressed pause due to the pandemic.
Well, That's a tricky question because I don't know the brand, the category, or any of that. I think you have to look at that curve that I shared early in the presentation and understand what's the same and what's different. I mean, what does the consumer need? How can this brand be the most empathetic brand to launch after the crisis and have the need states or palette states or day parts or other factors that this brand needs to look at changed? And have if those states have changed, then how does that brand need to pivot? I don't think launching a new brand post-crisis is a bad thing. I mean, if you want to look at crises, many times some of the most exciting brand launches to ever happen in a crisis. After the Great Depression, Fortune magazine was launched by William Luce, and he charged $1 for an issue, which was what it would cost to get a nice sweater back in the day, right? We're talking about the late 20s, right? And it was a very profitable, very widely read old school magazine. It's about making sure you understand clearly these need states, which could have shifted, and then making some adjustments to these the brand platform, and thinking really hard about using brand action as a launching point. I would also say, narrow, not knowing what they're going to do, narrow the geographic focus. I'd rather win in a small geography and have a huge passion and be able to move to a bigger geography than try to do something really wide without the passion, because it's hard to create passion. So if I have the opportunity, again, not knowing the nuances of this, I want to create passion in a more tightly confined geography, and geography could be physical geography, or it could be a slice of a category, and then move on. And because that passion can move from one physical geography or virtual slice of a category to another.
Someone is asking, besides brands, could you also give examples about what malls could do in the crisis?
What malls could do in a crisis? I haven't sat down and thought about it. It sounds like a great consulting project, but I think, I know that I have a father-in-law who's in his early 80s who up until recently loved going to the mall and walking. And usually when he would walk, he'd end up some of the time picking up something that they wanted at home as well. I don't know with, the COVID crisis and health and shelter at home in many parts of the US already in place, what would be the most useful action a mall could take? I'd probably look at the framework I described around being empathetic, what's uniquely true to their brand, avoiding harms, and taking action. Is there something they could do for healthcare workers? Could they set up testing the way, I don't know. Obviously, getting people together in groups is something to be avoided. So it's tricky, and I don't have a fast thought about that. But what's uniquely true about that mall? What makes that mall uniquely valuable to the people it serves? And then, is there something that they could do that would add good to society? And if the answer is no, then you might have to pause.
And someone's asking, how do you implement purpose and sustainability at a smaller level if you're a startup that recently launched with no longitudinal authority? He's saying, he or she is saying, most of the brands that you mention are large MNCs. This is for a natural sleep aid in this case.
Yeah, I mean, Tony's Chocolonely is not tiny, but it's pretty small. I mean, compared to the other brands in the chocolate category, it's an ant. It's not an elephant. If I used other examples, many of them started very small. I mean, Bombas is a bigger company today than when they started, but they're, still, I doubt they have 100 employees. I'd be surprised. It's possible. And so, in the book, The Purpose Advantage, I specifically outline a process using, if you're a larger brand or aspire to be, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but if you're not a larger brand and you just aspire to have a successful blueprint, what's uniquely something you can do that would be highly valuable to the communities you serve, to the consumer you serve, that adds tremendous value, because ultimately word of mouth and word of mouse drive most smaller brands. They don't spend enough to win based on anything other than word of mouth and word of mouse. And so I look at product design or business model design to give me an advantage, and then I go from there. I mean, Tony's, I don't think they spend anything in marketing other than they think about their packaging. And in their packaging, if you were to actually look, you'd see that they're trying to end slavery in West Africa. Now, if you don't love their flavor and it's not priced fairly, then you don't have a chance. But assuming you love the flavor and assuming it's priced fairly, who wouldn't want to eat chocolate that's going to end slavery versus grabbing something from another company? So, so my answer is, I think the best time to start is early. Most of the work we do is for brands trying to, change their, their brand and adapt and evolve. But if you're a startup, you don't have to deconstruct. You have the chance to build it in from scratch as part of the DNA. And if you look at a lot of these high performing brands that are bigger now, the Tonys, the Bombas, and they're not huge. Mod Pizza's actually gotten very big very quick. But a few years ago, it was a handful of shops in Seattle. They built it in. I mean, the owners, Allie and Scott of Mod, they wanted an affordable pizza place where people could earn a living wage. There's no unique pepperoni or mozzarella. It's the business model design. So my advice is to focus on the business model design and to make sure you connect the purpose and sustainability to that business model design. The simplest example is that 7th generation visual I showed, which came right out of the book.
Great. And Rob Van Alphen says, we might have covered this a little bit, but it might be a nice summary. He's asking, what are the 3 key things that brands should do for purpose, but not also to become a mere marketing slogan?
Well, I would start with, I think it's fair to ask, I would start with business model design. If you can create a flywheel that aligns to your financial model, that's a winning flywheel. If you try to come up with a great marketing idea, it's much harder to sustain that if it's not connected to the business model. So when I talk about Mod Pizza, they have an advantage of a couple hundred basis points in their operating model, which is huge because their people aren't going to quit as frequently as someone who works for the average QSR or fast casual restaurant. They have an advantage in terms of guest experience because their employees are more happy to have a job because they were incarcerated or they were, in a situation where they were without work for a prolonged period of time. So there is a business model construct there. Same with the other examples I've shared. So number 1, business model. Number 2, brand's editorial authority. You really want to create something that's consistent with the brand's editorial authority. Number 3, I would tend to think inside before I think outside. Because almost all of the brands that I interviewed, the CEOs talked about their brand culture. I remember talking to the CEO of Ben & Jerry's and, flavors and asking all kinds of questions. And every time it got back to the people who worked at the plant. And without telling them I was doing this, I actually showed up in Vermont and took a plant tour without telling them. And the hourly employee who gives a plant tour, it actually sounds just like the CEO. How many companies with a few hundred employees have an hourly employee in their company who basically has the same knowledge of the brand DNA? So number 1, business model. Number 2, editorial authority, making sure it's consistent. And probably number 3 would be, making sure that your internal stakeholders really are the first people to get exposed to that idea. If they don't believe it, how are you going to convince consumers to believe it? It's not going to happen. Or on a B2B basis, how are customers going to believe it? We had a meeting at Barkley yesterday. We have people in every time zone, nearly 400 people. And we published a document around March 14th called 400 Offices that's online if people want it. So we went from 4 offices to 400, right, as everyone did. And we told folks in this meeting, our CEO said, hey, our number 1 job, take care of our clients, take care of our people. We have no intention, if we can avoid it, of having to furlough anyone. We can't guarantee that. That's impossible. But that is not, we're going to reduce our profits and we're going to operate this company to take care of our customers and take care of our employees for as long as we possibly can. And we've got a long runway. Now, if you're one of the 400 people who works at the company, you get really excited about how you feel about your company. And you are going to work harder to take care of the clients because the company's got your back. Now, every company is different, and not all companies would take that view that, less profits is acceptable. But I think you have to look at your company's purpose and your soul and decide what you're going to do. And every brand has a different DNA. So that business model place is a common starting point. I won't say that every purpose and sustainability workshop flows the same way. I outlined a process in the book, but you have to adapt that process to fit the people you're working with. And it's harder actually to do this if you're a really, really large company sometimes, because you have so many stakeholders that you have to get to align. So some of you who work in a middle-sized kind of company, billion-dollar company, it's often easier to do this than if you work at a multi-billion-dollar company, because you have more people who have to align on it.
Great. And we were able to work through all of them for now. Those were awesome answers.
Well, thank everyone for joining. I'm happy to take questions offline, and happy to share the content I referenced, some of which is on barclayus.com, or if you can't find it there, you can email me, or you can see in LinkedIn that I'm posting most of this content daily so that people can see not only a point of view from me, but the interviews I'm doing with these other experts who are often CEOs of companies that are high performing. I'm trying to post that almost every day on LinkedIn.